Welcome, everyone, and thank you for making it out here near the end of the semester when things start moving fast and getting difficult. I'm Professor Aaron O'Connell. I'm a faculty fellow here at the Clements Center for National Security, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this discussion of the National Defense Strategy of the United States with General Robert Neller, the 37th Commandant of the Marine Corps. I'd also like to thank the Strauss Center for co-hosting this event with Clements, and since I have you all here as a captive audience, let me just note that we will have one more event this semester on December 5th in this room. At the same time, we will all welcome former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Amanda Sloat for a talk on Brexit, causes and consequences, and I welcome you all to that event as well. General Neller hates long introductions, which makes sense because it takes a long time to note the accomplishments of a man who has spent at least 44 years in uniform serving in the nation's defense. I will tell you, however, he is a native of East Lansing, Michigan. He graduated from the University of Virginia and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps in 1975. He has served as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps at all levels, including command of a Marine Security Force company during Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989. And as the commander of the 3rd Light Armored Infantry Battalion during Operation Restore Hope in Somalia. As a general officer, General Neller served as the Assistant Division Commander for the 2nd Marine Division, as the Deputy Commanding General for Operations for 1MEF during Operation Iraqi Freedom from 2005 to 2007, and as the Division Commander of the 3rd Marine Division, and later as President of Marine Corps University. In 2015, General Neller succeeded General Joseph Dunford as the 37th Commandant of the Marine Corps, and in July 2019, he retired from the Marine Corps after over 4 decades in uniform. He joined the Clements Center this year as one of our distinguished senior fellows, and honestly, we couldn't be more pleased to have him. Now, since many of you may not have heard from someone who has been both the head of an armed service and a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff before, let me just make one key note that might help you when we get to the Q&A portion. General Neller has at least 2 jobs when he was serving as the Commandant of the Marine Corps. First, he's the highest-ranking officer in the United States Marine Corps. He reports directly to the United States Secretary of the Navy and is responsible for ensuring the organization, the policies, the plans, and the programs for the Marine Corps. So, then, as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the JCS, General Neller also advised the President, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Secretary of the Navy on all matters involving the Marine Corps. So there's really 2 separate fields of endeavor here, 2 areas of expertise. As the Commandant, he had overall responsibility. The buck stopped with him on everything pertaining to the recruiting, training, equipping, and preparing of the Marine Corps to fight the nation's wars. And as one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he advised the President, the Secretary of Defense, and other senior leaders on any military aspect of a given foreign policy or security policy issue. So there's enormous expertise here, and here's how we'll proceed. The General will first speak for a few minutes on the National Defense Strategy to give you an overview of this important document that lays out how the military will implement the National Security Strategy of the United States. Then we'll transition to a moderated Q&A by myself and Dr. Paul Edgar, the Associate Director at the Clements Center. Then we will open the conversation up, and we're shooting for about 20 or 30 minutes of questions from you, the audience. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage the 37th Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Robert Neller.
Thanks very much for being here. It's my first event with a public event here with the Clements Center, so I'm excited to be able to do this and to talk about the National Defense Strategy. So, this thing goes. Okay. So we had a new administration. I've been the Commandant since September 2015, at the end of the Obama administration, and then when President Trump won the election, we had a new administration. So what happens at the Pentagon, other than for the uniformed military, a lot of the civilians, they move on. Some of them stay for a period of time, but as you remember, then General Mattis was nominated to be the Secretary of Defense. And it required a waiver from Congress because he had not been out of service for 7 years. I think the only time that happened previous was with George Marshall. So it was confirmed, and immediately set out to try to establish a national defense strategy. Normally this is done with this thing called a quadrennial defense review, and they decided they weren't going to do that. And so a group of writers picked by the Secretary with support from the OSD staff, the joint staff, the services, everybody had representation, and started to write this document. At that time, you remember there was a lot of discussion about the readiness of the force, the posture of the force, the missions of the force, the size of the force, and the budget. So if you read this document, and it's available, the unclassed version is online, it's right here. It's actually not a bad read, and it includes a great number of the things that are in the classified version. So we'll go into this in some detail if you want to, but several things that are in this document that I think are worthy of our attention. First, there's a recognition right up front that we are no longer in the place we were 10 or 15 years ago. We are in a competitive environment, we're against pure competitors, and whatever advantage we had after we came out of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, when the Soviet Union went away, the United States was a single power, the indispensable nation, if you will, in the United States. The advantages we had with the revolution of military affairs and all the things with precision and all that, those advantages had begun to erode, in that we had competitors. So there's recognition of peer competition, specifically mentioned the Chinese and the Russians. Now, the previous strategies had the usual 4+1, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then the one being terrorism. This document acknowledges those. But we'll get into what the priority is, because the priority changed, and it's very clearly stated in here. And yet there's still an acknowledgement that we still had a counterterrorism fight, that fight, despite our best efforts, that we're in a very, very long war since 9/11. It's been 18 years now, and some of you, with all due respect, were very, very young. And most of us were much younger and wish we still were, but we're not. But you think about that young men and women joining our military today have to be taught about 9/11 because they haven't been born yet. They have to be taught what happened on that day. They have to be made to understand. And for all of us, you think back to where you were on that day, how you felt that day, and how the world basically changed on that day. And that everything that we've done militarily since then, for the most part, has been focused. And I'm not here to talk about whether it was a right decision to go here or go there. That's your personal opinion. You deal with the realities, but the fact is, part of our strategy has to do with the fact that we're still involved in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in other places around the world. And we still have a CT fight, despite the defeat of the ISIS caliphate in Syria. There still is a terrorist threat, not just in the Middle East, but across the globe. And I think also in here, it was something that came up during the time when I was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is that we used to think about fighting regionally. We used to focus that, well, if we fight in the Middle East, it'll be contained in the Middle East. If we do something in the Pacific, it'll be contained in the Pacific, or something wherever. That's not the case anymore, because everything now has global implications. It probably did before, but it much more than previously, because we're looking at the domains that we're fighting in, and I'll talk about that. Let's see if I can make this go forward. Where am I putting this?
You put it there. There you go.
So the process. As I mentioned, Secretary Mattis formed a writing group, people, and he gave guidance, initial guidance, and all the players were involved. And I can say this, when the final document came out, I think most people, nobody's ever perfectly satisfied when you've got, you kind of end up with a watered down version, because some people say, hey, we got to say something about this, we got to say something about that. But my view is that I thought it was a very inclusive effort. Everybody got to state their case. Now, whether all their comments and all their thoughts, or small dogs to puppies, or happy to glad, got changed in the final document, probably didn't happen. But I know that we went through 60+ iterations of this thing. And it was finally published in January of 2018, just under a year after Secretary Mattis was confirmed. And it lays out, I think, a very different path. I mentioned the post-Soviet period, the post-9/11, two kind of setting points where the United States had to change their policy. If you remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the United States was the unquestioned, preeminent military power on this earth, hands down. And everybody watched Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the 100-hour war to liberate Kuwait, the beginning of the revolution of military affairs, the precision and kinetics that was delivered with precision, that command and control that was uncontested. But remember, that was 1991. No cell phones, or very rudimentary cell phones. No idea what the internet was, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Amazon. A very basic, simple world. And at the same time, all the other nations of the world took notice. But they really weren't able to do anything about it because they didn't have the resources or the wherewithal to do it. This document recognizes that that's all changed. That we're in a different place. And it's evolved over time that we've come to this place, and we have to recognize that we are no longer the unquestioned preeminent military power of the United States. That even the quote in here, and I know this is directly from Secretary Mass, the United States has no preordained right to believe that they're going to show up anyway. We are not. That's gone. Before, we kind of expected that because there really was no way, there was no one out there that could contend against our capabilities. So some of the things in this document, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, and I'm mindful of the time. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, but let me just cover a few points that are mentioned in the introduction. As I said, clearly states that the primary competitors of pure competition are the Chinese and the Russians. And we had worried about, we knew that, and we knew they were rising powers, but we knew that they had always remained nuclear powers, that they had a nuclear capability. So that's obviously something you have to pay attention to. But it's their increase in conventional capability that has become, I think, evident over time. On the backdrop of this is a framed international order based on rules. You've seen the Russians annex the Crimea, you've seen the Russians go into eastern Ukraine and the Donbass, you've seen the Chinese, despite International Convention on Law of the Seas, fighting against them in an international court, build up military capabilities in the South China Sea, and militarize those even after President Xi said no, told President Obama, no, we will not militarize these bases, and they've done exactly that. So the order that came out of World War II, this kind of United Nations-based order where people would follow the rules, and there was kind of an agreement amongst nation states that people were going to more or less comply. Not always. That's beginning to fray. There's an acknowledgement of an acceleration of technology. The Pentagon used to be, because of their resources, the place where all developmental things, that's where the internet came from. That's where these different things came from. Rocket engines and different things and technologies and global positioning system, because the Pentagon had the money. Now the Pentagon is looking to the commercial side. You look to Apple, you look to Microsoft, you look to Google, because they've got huge piles of cash and huge capabilities to do things. But yet they have to be able to work within the confines of a governmental system, which isn't always, my opinion, my words, no one else's, conducive to going fast and iterating products. I mean, we expected our iPhone, I thought it was pretty cool this spring when I got my first iPhone. I got iPhone 8, what are we on now, 11? We're on 11. Okay, in what, 6 months? It's very difficult for the government because of rules and restrictions and things to iterate things that fast. But that's the speed of technological change. And we knew that we were falling behind, and we needed to be more like the commercial side. And then the last part that the strategy recognizes was the lack of resources. The the Congress passed a thing called the Budget Control Act, otherwise known as sequestration, which severely restricted funding of the military. And it had an effect. It had effect on our ability to maintain our readiness. It had an effect on our ability to innovate and procure new things. We went through a government shutdown. We had a number, particularly on our civilian side, I believe, because they couldn't count on the government and they're very talented, capable people left. They left and went to the civilian side. The Marine Corps, because the force had grown for the end of Iraq and Afghanistan, we were in a drawdown, very rapid drawdown, and the budget tells you how much money you can have to build a force of a certain size. And all the services had gotten smaller. So you've got less capacity because your size is down, driven by the budget, and then the readiness of the force you have is degraded because you don't have the money. And at the same time, so you need to modernize. And so in order to modernize, the dilemma that you face in the Department of Defense is, I've got current operations that I have to do with my legacy force. I've got to maintain that force because I got to deploy young men and women like this sit down here to the front, to your right front, because I want them to have the right gear so that they can accomplish their mission. And at the same time, I've got to invest and I've got to transition to a modern force. It's different, and I am fiscally constrained. Now, due to the support of the administration and the generosity of Congress the last 2 years, last year we even had a budget on time. It actually was agreed and approved by 1 October. We don't have a budget this year. And we're still on a continuing resolution, and in fact, if the Congress doesn't pass an extension, the government's going to run out of money Thursday, if you pay attention to those types of things. So it appears that they have a solution to extend the continuing resolution to fund the government until the 20th of December, and they'll go home on their break, and they'll come back and hopefully they'll not pass the CR, they'll pass a budget. But we're not here to talk about the budget and all those things. So that's the backdrop of the strategy that's in the introduction. So there's 3 major lines of effort in the strategy. Build a more lethal and ready force, strengthen alliances and partnerships, attract new partners, and reform the department for greater performance and affordability. We could spend the next hour talking about each one of these. But the first one, suffice it to say, deals with what I just talked about. Hey, we have to have, the force that we have has to be ready. We have to have high rates of readiness, the force has to be trained, and then over time we have to transition it to a modern force. We don't need people driving trucks or using equipment that was bought during the Reagan buildup in the 80s. And we still do. And that's not gonna happen overnight. But the budgets we've received, I know $730 billion seems like a lot of money, and it's because it is. And the department needs to do, and it's acknowledged in the strategy, needs to do a much better job of making sure that every dollar that is appropriated is spent well. So there was a lot of effort about improving the readiness of force, improving the training of the force, and getting ourselves back so that we were more competitive in this very competitive world. The second line of effort, and again, if you've ever, Secretary Mattis is probably the most, I've never met a guy who didn't want to go to war more than him. But if he went to war, he was going to kick your ass. And he would tell you that. Hey, we're here to deter. The purpose of the Department of Defense is to deter conflict and provide negotiating space because of our capability for our diplomats. But if we have to go fight, we have to win. American people expect us to win. And we need our partners to do that. The center of gravity of America's strength around the world is the fact that we have partners and allies. And so the strategy goes at great lengths to talking about how important it is for us to go out there and maintain the alliances we have, whether it be NATO, whether it be Asia Pacific, whether it be bilateral relationships, whatever it is. And we need to continue to go out there and build and create new partnerships. Because I will tell you, I use the Chinese as an example. So you've heard of the One Belt, One Road initiative, where they go out and they operationalize their great capital resources. They try to buy ports, they try to buy airfields, they try to buy resources, and then on top of that, they want to lay down this inner network so that they can commercialize this, and then they'll use money to, with not a lot of strings attached, to countries that probably need the resources. And in the meantime, the Chinese are able to get the markets. So they use an economically based strategy. It's very brilliant, it's very effective, but we have to be out there and compete against them. And at the same time, our traditional allies and partners, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in the Far East, we need to continue to maintain those relationships because that gives us access, it gives us influence, it gives us markets. It's the whole interagency, diplomacy, information, military, economic, all the elements of national power. Because the military by itself, and this document recognizes that, cannot do it alone. You need all elements of military power. And then the last line of effort, as I mentioned, is to reform the Department of Defense to be able to innovate faster, to modernize faster, to be at the forward leading edge of technology, which requires us to partner with commercial entities. And so we're working on that, and not without some friction or some tension, but that's where we have to go, because that's where, just like this, the contract to develop a cloud-based storage for data and all that, whoever gets that, I'm agnostic to who it is, but we need to have that because we have to go, and we have to be protected. So a couple other things, and then we'll sit down and try to talk through some of this stuff. Other themes, I mentioned priorities. Clearly, the Pacific is first. In the unclassed version, it talks about the Pacific, and it talks about Russia, it talks about the Middle East, and then it talks about terrorism, and then it talks about Africa. Surprisingly, nothing is mentioned in the unclassed version about the Arctic. And it talks about Western Hemisphere. My personal view, I understand why Pacific first and Russia, but in our own hemisphere here, I think we should never take what happens both north and south of our borders for granted, because we need those partners, and those are our interior lines that we need to have secure if we're going to be able to operate and be able to project power from this country. Your military does not play home games. We had a home game on 9/11. We don't want another home game. We want all our games to be away games. And away games require a certain capability to move your force to a place away from home, and that is much, much more difficult. Other countries, all they worry about is fighting a home game within inside their own interiors. We don't do that because we don't want that to happen. There's a term in here called expand the competitive space. So as China goes around and uses capital as an operational weapon, we need to be in that same place to compete with them. For example, in the Western Pacific, there's countries there, some of them actually still recognize Taiwan as China. The Solomon Islands is a good example, and the Chinese were down there trying to use money to influence the government there to recognize them, and then they would be able to get access to ports and airfields and things like that. And we need to be out there, along with our allies, along with Australia, along with New Zealand, along with the Philippines, along with Thailand, along with Vietnam, and the Philippines, to compete out there with these countries and give them the economic aid so that they pick us, again, my view, us as opposed to the Chinese. But so expanding this competitive space to be out there diplomatically, informationally, economically, expand that competitive space, because we want to deter the fight, we don't want to have to fight, but if we do have to fight, we need partners and allies. The document makes a clear discussion that when we used to talk about military capability, we used to talk about air, land, and sea. Okay, those were the domains that we fought in. But now there's more domains. Now it talks about cyber as a domain, an operational domain. It talks about space as an operational domain, and it even talks about information, the use of information, which is nothing new. I mean, information has been used as a weapon. It used to be called propaganda or whatever, use of pamphlets or writing or posters. That's nothing new, but now because of social media and the network, you can do it quickly. Twitter is a great example of an information operation capability. And we see it every day, for good and for bad. And the other things that were mentioned is force posture training, that the force posture the United States has is pretty much the same force posture when World War II ended and we set everybody down and we ended up as an occupying force in Germany and Japan and in South Korea for treaties, and we had bases around, and a lot of those bases are gone because we recognize the sovereignty of those nations, but the forces are still predominantly in the same place. Is that where we need to be in the future in order to be able to operate? I would say no. But you have to have some place where you can go, where you can close the force, assemble the force, and then project the force further on. Talking about training, again, 18 years of, except for the march up in Iraq in 2003, we've been fighting pretty much a stability, counterinsurgency operation. Now we need to get prepared to fight a peer who has capabilities that are, in many cases, equal, if not greater, to ours. And we haven't done that since I was a young officer in the 80s when we thought we were going to fight the Soviet Union. So it changes everything about your training, how you think about things, how you perceive the battlefield you're going to be in, and what you do with equipment and your training and how you train that force. Deployment is the last thing, and again, just another observation. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and since even after Desert Shield, we have deployed our force without any problem. We went where we wanted to go and did what we wanted to do when we wanted to do it. Based on the capabilities of our potential competitors, our adversaries, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I mean, if you were going to fight the United States, would you just let the United States sail, fly, deploy a force on your border and let them assemble that force if you had the wherewithal to stop it? Particularly if you could stop it without firing a shot, using the network to destroy their ability to organize and give orders and instructions. You know, one of TRANSCOM, the Transportation Command, which is one of the unified commands that moves us around the world, most of the movements that they use are commercial, and that's all on an unclassified network. Is that network secure? Is your network secure? Is anybody reading your email? The answer is no, it's not secure, and yes, they are. And just because you sent it and you thought you were adding encryption doesn't mean that you didn't leave those fingerprints. So we could go on about that. But I believe it's a very good document. The proof is going to be in the execution. As much as we want to transition to focus on the Pacific and Europe and Russia, we continue to be drawn back to the Middle East because of the terrorism threat. You know, as a friend of mine said, the Europeans want you to come back, the Arabs think you're leaving, and the Asians don't think you're coming. So if the strategy is to go to the Pacific and reinforce our relationship with Europe and NATO, it's going to take some adjustments, and we're in the process of doing that now. So those were my prepared remarks, and then we'll go ahead and take some questions.
Thank you very much, General. This just in case we did have a map, just to see if I can make this go forward backwards. No, I cannot.
Other way.
There we go. Some, just in case people want to put some of these places on a map, I think that will help. Thank you very much. I think that was insightful and gave us a great place to start. So what we'll do now is we'll moderate a Q&A for about 30 minutes, then we'll open things up for the rest of you. And what I'd like to start with is actually a little bit removed from your talk, but we do have the former Commandant of the Marine Corps here, so you don't often get this opportunity. I'd just like to start by giving you an opportunity to let our audience know exactly what the Marine Corps does. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of folks who, if you just ask about the armed forces, there's a general set of assumptions. If it's on the land, the Army does the fighting. If it's in the air, that's the Air Force. If it's on the seas, that's the Navy. Well, that's not really accurate at all, and of course the Marine Corps fights on land, on air, and on sea. So maybe just to start, so we can get the perspective of what you as a commandant are looking at when facing these problems around the world, what does the Marine Corps do, and what is its contribution to national defense?
Well, the legal stated mission of the Marine Corps is to be able to seize and secure advanced naval bases in support of the naval campaign. So we are a naval force. We are a part of the Department of the Navy. After World War II, National Security Act, I believe 1947 or 51, made the Marine Corps a separate service within the Department of the Navy. And so that still remains our mission. But it seems like every generation or so, whether it be Korea, Vietnam, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, or now the global war on terrorism, we ended up getting into as a sustained campaign ashore, which is really not what we're organized training people to do, although we've done that throughout our history. So in this strategy, I didn't mention it, it actually does tell the services in the classified version, and I'll be careful here, specifically what to focus on, not at the exclusion of others. But when you look at the map, and you look at, remember the threats were China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. I asked Dr. O'Connell to use this kind of a map because normally the map, it shows the Atlantic in the middle. That's the traditional view of America. We show the United States or our hemisphere, and then Europe on the other side, and then the Pacific is split because it's kind of an afterthought. Now this puts the Pacific dead center in the map to let you know that's, and you can see the immense distances involved that were dealt with by our forces in World War II. So the Marine Corps mission is to support the naval campaign, and in the strategy, you would think an Army is a continental force, so you can look at this and who is a continental power against those threats, and who is a maritime capability. And so that's what we're looking at, and we have our space within the operations, the multi-domain operations. The force is a joint force. The Air Force does Air Force missions. We talked about special operations, and you've got others. So the joint force is critically important. So everybody has to be operationally honest, is what I call it, intellectually honest about what you can and cannot do. And so it's a team game, and we don't want to be the Army. We're not the Army. I want a big, heavy junk Army that can go somewhere and fight a sustained land campaign and do heavy logistics. I want a very capable Air Force that can operate in space and in the air, and I want a Navy that can move forces across the sea, protect lines of commerce. And then the Marine Corps is there to do our capabilities. The strategy also talks about 4 layers or zones: a contact zone, a blunt zone, a surge force, and a homeland defense force. I believe the Navy and the Marine Corps are that contact blunt force, because you want your Navy and Marines forward deployed, underway, away from home, able to see what's going on, and then you have to have a force available to surge if this thing becomes beyond, if it goes beyond their capability to handle it.
Because there's such a different set of capabilities for a
Yes.
force to arrive immediately and be combat ready, as opposed to have the amount of facilities, logistics, equipment, and capacity to stay in fight for longer.
And part of a naval force is you're supposed to be able to be self-sustained logistically by coming from the sea.
Great. I think we could now transition to those specific threats that you gave us a preview of, and for each of these, I think it'd be great to kind of try to understand what threat these nations or networks pose to America's vital national interest. And we typically separate out, if something is a vital national interest, it means you're willing to use force to defend it. It's not just something you want, it's something that you're willing to be violent to keep or to protect. So why don't we move through it? The NDS actually separates things out into 2 revisionist powers, 2 rogue regimes, and 1 network terrorism. So maybe we start with Russia as one of those 2 revisionist regimes who want to change the existing rules. And if you could just give us your sense of what threat do they actually pose to American vital interests, and what is the military piece of countering, mitigating, or dealing with that threat?
Well, the fact that Russia and China and North Korea, and we don't believe yet Iran are nuclear powers. I mean, and that is clearly something that that is a risk to the security of the United States. And the current Russian regime has stated that they might even use tactical nuclear weapons in their doctrine. So I think the Russians, they have gone through they've gone down and they've been built back up. The military is not the same size as it was, but they modernized and recapitalized because they had enough money from their oil. And then they've exercised that military in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, and now in Syria. So are they, do I see them as they could be a threat to the United States, but I think they're going to invade Europe like we thought they were going to do during the Cold War. They've threatened other NATO nations, they've threatened the Baltic states. They are involved politically, they're active in cyber. So I think in the near term that they have shown themselves to be the most aggressive of these potential threats. In other words, when we say threat, threat has two things. You have to have capability and you have to have intent. Do they have capability? Yes. Do they have intent? They have shown intent in certain places on the world. So, and particularly to threaten our allies, the NATO allies. So that's why you see U.S. forces, predominantly U.S. Army forces, beginning to reestablish a posture in Eastern Europe because those countries that are members of the NATO alliance are concerned and they see the United States there as an ability to improve stability. So I think we've changed our posture because of the Russians, and I think we've the support to the Ukraine government to help them fight that fight that continues to go on today. The Syria thing is very complicated, and I don't have any solution to that right now. But the Russians have become much more aggressive, and I think it's in our best interest to pay attention to them. At the same time, we want to talk to them. And this strategy says that despite some of the actions of these potential nation states, we still at the same time want to maintain a dialogue and talk to them.
So the idea here is that if we increase our capacity, if we increase our capabilities, if we message properly, then it seems we have an opportunity to change some of their policies, which are being aggressive in separate sort of spheres. But isn't the reverse also possible, that by stationing more capabilities with our NATO partners in Europe, by actually building up certain lethalities, pursuing new high technology issues, we're actually going to incentivize them to increase their own buildup? I mean, this is the standard Thucydides trap. Actions you take to try to make yourself feel safe, make the other people feel less safe, and then you have an escalatory cycle. Is that a concern?
I think so, but it's just like we have certain agreements with the Russians, like strategic arms reduction talks, the internet, the INF treaty, which we didn't believe that they were complying with it. So now I believe we've let it expire. Open Skies Treaty. So when you have a potential adversary and you want to manage it, you establish sort of rules and treaties and policies and things to try to temper the potential for a miscalculation. And so I think those are important. And at the same time, we still meet and talk to them in whatever forms there are around the world, and we need to do that. So the dialogue has got to be there because the idea is not to have to go to war. You want to deter war. So as you build your capabilities, you don't want to be disadvantaged so that you're blackmailed, but you also have to be mindful of this kind of arms race where you build up and build up. And so at what point? So that's part of the politics of this. That's the political leadership and the diplomacy where they have to figure out where that knee in the curve is, where enough is enough and not too much.
Okay, let's turn to China if we could. It's a very similar question here. What is China doing that presents threats or risks to American vital national security interests? And what are the military pieces of responding there?
Well, to respond to China, I don't see China as an immediate threat. I think it's more of a long-term threat. But President Xi is pretty much, they have a plan, they have a vision that 100-year plan is by 2042 or whatever it is, that they are going to be the leading nation in the world, both economically, informationally, and that's all good, and we have worked with them. We work with them in piracy things in the Middle East, but they're again, this relationship, we see ourselves now trying to come up with what we consider an equitable trade agreement with them, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that, because if we can do that and maintain economic fairness and trade, then the desire for anybody to do anything incorrectly will, or miscalculating, will go down. So I think it's just interesting to watch the Chinese. They've got things that we do that continue to agitate them, and they do things that obviously are of concern to us. Not so much some of them militarily, a lot of things in cyber, a lot of things in information, a lot of things in economics. So we have to maintain that dialogue, and this trade agreement discussions that are ongoing is just part of that. So the rise of China's military capability is pretty significant, particularly in the last 15 years. And how they grew this fast and where they got the technology and where they found this stuff is probably a discussion for a different place at a different time, not in an open public forum. But they are very capable. They are very focused. They are worthy of our attention, and I think what we want to find is that balance point with them, where we're always going to be competitors economically, but where this competition is done on rules that are fair to both sides, and that militarily we work together to maintain a stable world so that commerce and things can flow, and we don't have a miscalculation.
Okay, perhaps we can we'll just do sort of 2 to 5 minutes on each of these just to frame the conversation, yeah? If we could turn to the rogue powers now, right, the way the national defense strategy is set.
Does this get easier?
I think so. Let's see. Is that there are 2 revisionist powers trying to rewrite the rules, and then there are indeed 2 rogue powers that simply refuse to obey the rules. The NDS is focused on North Korea and Iran. And so if I could just ask, it seems like this is a perfect example of this topic where actions taken to make one side feel more secure can have adverse consequences. So actions we've taken militarily to try to convince North Korea and Iran to reduce or halt nuclear weapons programs seem mostly to produce escalation. And so I'm just curious, do you see a military method or a military path to getting North Korea or Iran to abandon nuclear weapons, or is that primarily a diplomatic task, where the military supports by being ready and credible?
Unless you would suggest that we would go, take away their capability, I don't see a military option. So I fully support the diplomatic, but the fact is as the strategy says, the capability of the U.S. military provides leverage and weight to our diplomatic efforts. So we have to have the capability. Obviously, North Korea and Iran are going to do what's in the best interest for their nation. They have to become members of the world community. They have to follow rule-based order. They can't be involved illegally supporting terrorism or in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or the sale of missile technology, or involved in other conflicts around the world where they are against a sovereign nation. But again, I think this administration has made an effort, certainly with North Korea, to try to sit down and come up with some sort of a diplomatic solution. But I think that again, you'd have to ask Kim Jong-un, what his thoughts are. But I believe the offer was, you get rid of your nuclear weapons, and we will support you economically, and you can develop your country as such. It's much more complicated than that. And so far, it appears that the answer to that has been, well, I'll think about it, but I want you to give me these concessions first. And the answer so far appears to have been no. Iran is another solution, another problem set. And again, I'm not an Iran or North Korean expert, but I think as a military former member of the U.S. military, and we see the Iranian influence around the globe. They're very capable within their capacity, and they seem to want to not comply again with UN mandates and other international forums that establish rules that normally we would abide by. So there was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which there was a time period when they were going to not enrich uranium, which would have precluded them from building a weapon. The United States, there was 5 or 6 parties involved in that discussion. The United States didn't walk away from that agreement, and so now you see, at least in the open press, you see Iran saying they're going to start to enrich uranium again, and so that's not good. So there's other actors in the region, and the Iranians have done a number of things that they have denied, to include shooting down a U.S. drone in international airspace, and use proxies to shoot down U.S. drones over other countries. And so they're always out there trying to expand that competitive space and doing things which go right up to the edge of short potential conflict against the United States.
All right, I'd like to turn to an area that you have a great deal of personal experience in, and that is fighting terrorism. We have combat troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria, and all of this has been aimed at a strategy of dealing with terrorism that recognizes a role for lethal force in military operations, but insists that actually dealing with the problem in a holistic manner requires much more than just military force. So I think we can all appreciate the role of military force in what are so-called decapitation strategies, trying to take out senior leaders like Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I don't think anybody doesn't understand how military violence plays a role there. But another element of this is training up foreign security forces so that they themselves can handle the problem on our own. And there it seems the record is rather mixed. We've been training the Afghan National Security Forces since at least 2009. We spent many years training the Iraqi forces. When ISIS came in 2014, the Iraqi forces didn't fare very well. There still seems to be persistent, deep, debilitating corruption in the Afghan forces. How well do you think we can do that second mission of actually creating capable, responsive national security forces, army and police, so that they can handle these problems that we also have an interest in?
I would agree that our record has been mixed. And part of that has fluctuated, our number of people doing that. But I think the option is you have 3 choices. You go there and fight them yourself, and we accept the consequences of loss of American life and property. You train the foreign partner to do it to the best of their ability, and you work with them on their other institutions of government, or you leave. So I think we would all prefer to train the partner to do it and not have our forces there doing direct action against us against a critically high priority target like Baghdadi or any of those other individuals who are no longer breathe our air and eat our food. And I think leaving has its own list of potential consequences, because if you leave, there's the risk that someone else will come in and fill the vacuum. There is a space that's going to be filled. So to train them and work with them, you can't build a military. It takes a generation. And so we've been at it for a while. I think, remember when we were in Iraq, the Iraqi security forces were there, and then we left at the end of 2011. And then ISIS came up in Syria, and then they invaded Iraq, and the Iraqis, in most cases, were not effective in defending. There were some units that did actually stay and fight. And then we went back and offered our assistance, and it was the Iraqis themselves, with U.S. support and advisors and air power, that were actually did the fighting. And repelled ISIS, and then the Kurds in Syria did the same thing. So the model works, but it does take a sustained commitment. Afghanistan is a very complicated issue, and I never served there, so there are probably many in this room that have. I visited there a number of times, but it's not the same. as having served there. But I know there are Marines and soldiers there that are still trying, they're still there today. They're combat troops, but they're not just a small group are doing counterterrorism strikes, but the majority of them are there to train, advise, and assist the Afghans to give them the wherewithal and to secure their area. But again, there is no military solution. So until the Taliban and the Afghan government and all the other people that are potential players in this thing sit down and agree that, okay, we're going to stop fighting, that there's a better way to do this, the military can only provide leverage for our diplomats and for the host nation. Now, the host nation wants us to stay, and we're not in Afghanistan by ourselves. There's 40 plus other nations that are there with us, part of that coalition, partisan alliances, and so they're there in support, not maybe to the degree we are, but they're probably about half the force. And General Miller's over there trying to leverage this as the Afghans go through their political actions, and Ambassador Khalilzad tries to get the Taliban to come to the negotiating table and sign some sort of an agreement. But you've got to have something to give them leverage, and part of that leverage, I believe, is striking at the leadership and say, hey, look, how much longer does this go on? Because I believe what I've heard, I don't know this firsthand, but I think the Afghan people are tired. If you were born in Afghanistan in the early 80s, right, when the Russians came in and left, and then the Taliban took over, and then we had 9/11 and then other forces, you know nothing but war in your entire life. And I would think you would want it to end, but you have to do that. I mean, the U.S. military can't make that happen. That's got to be a political decision.
That's probably a good segue to my last question, and I want to make sure Dr. Edgar gets a chance to ask a question as well. But that last point, I think actually most of the students in this room have also never known a time when the United States was not at war. And I guess I'd just like to ask you, after such a distinguished career in the military, you're an extremely thoughtful man. What's your sense of that? And this all stems from the fact that we had a 9/11 attack, and then Congress passed the authorization for the use of military force that said the U.S. can go after terrorists anywhere, for any duration, or anyone that helps them forever. That's my paraphrase, but it's not far from what the actual authorization states. Do you feel we are a nation in a forever war, and is that harmful to our society or our institutions in any way?
I think a lot of people have thought about this. I know I've thought about this. But, you know, as long as there's somebody out there, if I sat here and told you that I believe that ISIS or Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban, or AlShabaab or Boko Haram didn't honestly want to do harm to this country, I would say we should just leave. But I believe they do. I believe they do. Not all of them. Some of them are just people who are uneducated and needed a job, and they're getting paid to carry a rifle. But their leaders, they actually have professed an ideology, whether it's culturally based or religious based or regionally based, that would put the United States at risk. So we're not out there willy-nilly going after everybody. We're going after people that we have actually believed have been, at least the organization has made a specific stated threat to attack the United States of America. Now, do I wish they didn't feel that way? I do. But it's become for them almost a business, in my opinion. And I would, you know, I can hope that this isn't a forever war, and that my grandchildren, my grandfather for the fourth time as of Sunday, you can play. But my fourth grandson will not be sitting in a room like this 20 years from now, having some old guy talking about fighting terrorists. But I'm not sure that's not going to happen.
Dr. Edgar, you served in Iraq. I don't know if you'd like to touch on anything we've already discussed or ask a different question before we open things up.
Well, sir, you already discussed much of what I was going to ask about your thoughts on Iraq right now. So we'll transition a little bit. May I also say that General Neller and I served in Fallujah together, and he put himself at risk for my unit, and put himself at risk in various ways in order to get us equipment, in order to get us things that we needed in order to protect our soldiers and provide the enemy that we face if we lose an opportunity to not be protected. But transitioning to last week and thinking about the future of war, when you met with our undergraduates last week, you discussed in reference to the Pacific Theater of Operations and anticipating what is to come. The cyber domain, information domain, space. And I thought you discussed these things. Everybody is always interested in the future of war and in these particular aspects, but you connected these things, I thought, in a more practical way to what combat fundamentally is. And so I was wondering, would you be willing to share your thoughts on that for this audience?
Well, the strategy actually talks about the changing character of war. And I could say it's an interesting academic discussion. So the nature of war is one side trying to impose their will on another. The proverbial two people in a dark room reaching out, trying to figure out where they are, and then grabbing them, and then trying to make the other person submit. I'm not so sure in 10 years if it's not going to be machines doing that. But the character of war has clearly changed. And because of the criticality of the domains we talked about, cyberspace and information. And so because the United States and even our adversaries have developed a way of fighting which is reliant on the network, reliant on some sort of global positioning system for the precision delivery of munitions and for the precision timing of their encryption, and it makes space absolutely essential. So now the United States, and I think has a Space Force. General Raymond is the commander of Space Force, or Space Command. I mean, we've always had a Space Command, but now they have been elevated to a unified command with their own commander as part of the United States Air Force. And that's fine. I think that's good because they'll give more attention, because it needs to be given more attention, just like we've given more attention to cybercom. General Nakasone is the director of National Security Agency, and also the commander of cybercom, that we're out there fighting this fight every day. So the reality is, in my view, if we are not, if there is another fight, and there's a fight going on every day. General Nakasone would come here, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but he would tell you in an unclassified version that every day the networks in the United States, not just the social media networks, but the networks that run our trains, that run our airlines, that run our water, that run our electricity, are all potentially under attack. That someone's trying to get inside them to be able to manipulate them if and when the time comes. And we have to make sure that those networks are secure and resilient. And so if there is a future fight, and you can read Peter Singer's book, Ghost Fleet, is a really good book. And I'm not getting a commission from Dr. Singer, from Peter Singer, but he and some of his partners have written extensively about the criticality of cyber. I think the next fight, if you were to fight the United States, or we were to fight any of those other potential adversaries, the first thing you would want to do is what? Gain the high ground. What's the high ground? Information, the network, and you have to sustain yourself in space. Because that's where all those things live. They all live. And space has a geographical dimension. Cyber and information are kind of an amorphous thing that are much more difficult to get your arms around, but yet they have there's a physical entity to all those things, because they require networks and servers and storage and routers and computers and people to at least set the conditions for those things to happen. So the next fight, if it were to come, and we hope it doesn't, I think is going to start and maybe end in those three domains. That's my personal opinion, which is why I think we all need to be very cautious about how we use our devices, how reliant we become. They always say, "Do you want me to save your password?" No. No, I don't want you to save my password. I'll type it in every single time because I don't want some algorithm to have my password. And I think we need to be conscious of the fact that that data out there is the new oil, and it's worth a lot of money, and people are willing to pay for it, or they're willing to steal it. So with that uplifting note,
One related follow-up question. This occurred to me again as you were talking to our students last week, and then afterwards when we visited the Nimitz Museum on Saturday of the theater, of the Pacific Theater. How does the Pacific Theater of War, more than Europe, more than maybe the fights that we've had since then, but how does the Pacific Theater of Operations in World War II anticipate this future of war? The distances, the standoff, the power projection, the speed, the necessity of communications, the tech that was involved. Oftentimes we think of, for example, we think of Gettysburg as anticipating World War I. Is this maybe something that we could think about as a microcosm for the future of large-scale combat?
Well, you study history so you don't make the same mistakes that were made in the past. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it does sometimes resemble what might happen in the future. So the geography of the Pacific is the geography of the Pacific. And if you look at the beginning of World War II, where the Japanese imperial military was and where they were, it's very similar to what the Chinese are trying to do. They're trying to establish geographical outposts to extend their reach of their weapons and their capabilities and their influence economically, so that if a nation there asks for our assistance or they want to do something we're not in the interest of the United States, our ability to go there would be challenging. So just like in World War II, the Japanese had extended out and we were able to work our way in. In a fairly short period of time, rather amazingly short period of time, less than 3 years. Go from a force of under 100,000 to a force of 10 million, travel, fight 2 theaters around the globe, and the nation then was mobilized for war. We've never been really mobilized for the war since 9/11. We've used all professional volunteer force to do this fight. 1% of the nation is involved in the military. And that's fine. You pay for that. You pay for their service. But this would be different. So I think the Pacific is worthy of study, particularly the geography and what particularly the People's Republic of China is trying to do out there economically. And it goes back to expand the competitive space. If we're content to let them go to Oceania and Tuvalu and New Caledonia and the Solomons and the Marianas and Saipan and the Gilbert Islands and buy airfields and ports and establish enclaves there based on economics, then we will deserve to get the geographical layout. The Chinese play a game called Go. It's a defensive game where you put marbles on a board to try to block your adversary from getting inside. They're, in my view, my personal opinion, they are involved in what I would call the economic game of Go globally right now. And they're putting marbles down all around the globe. Some places where we have marbles now. And they're asking the country there to pick their marble as opposed to ours. So this goes back to the strategies need to expand the competitive space, to challenge where we think is in our interest to challenge, not to have to compete economically and with foreign aid. Secretary Mattis had a famous quote. He said that he was asked if the State Department budget were cut by 25%, what would that mean? He said I'd have to increase the size of the military by 100%. So there's a recognition in the strategy and in those in uniform that this is an interagency fight, that expanding this competitive space is not a uniform military action. In reality, it's economic, it's diplomatic, it's information. We have to be out there and compete, and sell to these other nations that we are the partner of choice. We will be there and be reliable, that we will support you economically within our capabilities. We expect you to not be corrupt and value human rights, but at the same time, you know, we are the nation that you should choose. And to do that, you have to be present and you have to compete.
Okay. We have about 25 minutes for questions, folks, and what we'll do is we've got folks with microphones, so please wait for a microphone. When you take the microphone, please just let us know who you are, and if you're a student here, tell us what you're studying. And we'll start right over here.
Harvey Bird, retired. Question, how destabilizing has the current administration been to the implementation of the National Defense Strategy? I appreciate your appreciation of General Mattis, but he's been gone. Okay, and I'm curious as to the impact of the way this administration conducts business inhibiting our defense.
You know, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. And the Commander-in-Chief makes decisions and directs the U.S. military. The job of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs on behalf of the Joint Chiefs is to provide their best military advice. And so this strategy, I mean, you read that when Secretary Mattis resigned earlier this year, he read his letter. He didn't believe that his best military advice was necessarily being adhered to, and so he just said that you need to get somebody that's more in line with your view. At the same time, and Secretary Esper, who used to be Secretary of the Army, and I know General Milley, the current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, fully supports the fact that we need to build and maintain partnerships and alliances. And I don't think it's unfair for us to ask some of our allies and partners to provide more resources. I don't think that's unfair. But from time to time, there's always going to be political tension between what the military advice is and what the political leadership wants. It's probably been that way since the beginning of the United States. So there's always going to be challenges about this. And so there are certain styles and certain things that are probably not helpful in the execution of the strategy, but that's why we have elections.
Over here, Will.
Thank you for coming. So you mentioned earlier that the decay of the rules-based order you see as a problem for future security concerns. How do you think, or what role do you think the United States plays in either furthering or mitigating this decay in the future?
Well, we were the author of the rule-based order after World War II. It was the United States because we won, right? Along with the Soviet Union, France, UK, and what was then, which was then, China, which is now Taiwan. So we set up a system involving the United Nations and different treaties and North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Asia ASEAN and different bilateral things, and so we set this thing up. And so if you don't like it, I mean, it was done by others to maintain a certain level of stability in the world because we knew that the Soviet Union was going to be a potential competitor. And so if it's not going to be complied with, then what's going to take its place? You can't have people out there, nation states. That's why you do treaties, that's why you have negotiations, that's why our diplomats go back and forth. And the world has changed since then. There's no international convention on operations on the internet. There's discussions about, the Tokyo Convention or about climate. All these things are happening. So if you are not an internationalist and you think you can stay in your own country and just kind of ignore the rest of the world as things go around you, then that's certainly your prerogative. But I think as countries go out there and go their own way, there's got to be a way to, otherwise you're going to end up with a rather chaotic, unstable world, which some would say that's where we are now. And if there's an unstable world, then people make mistakes, and then we end up with conflict.
Come down here to the front, this Marine here.
He wishes he was a Marine.
John, you're 100% correct, sir. Commander Floyd, Executive Officer of the NRTC program. So to go back to the theme of alliances and partnerships, and I believe, sir, it was on your watch when you were Commandant, you and I believe former CNO Admiral Richardson, the decision to change PACOM to Indo-PACOM. If you would, Admiral, I'm sorry, General, in this form as much as you can, what was some of the rationale behind that decision, and was it simply just a signal to India? We want them to serve as a counterbalance to the rise of China. Thanks, sir.
So there are regional combatant commands who are assigned an area of responsibility based on how the United States views the world. So the Pacific Command, former Pacific Command, area of responsibility includes India, but it doesn't include Pakistan. I remember I was giving a briefing to a number of command and staff students from the Japanese Command and Staff College, and they had a Indian officer in their class. And he stood up and he goes, "How dare you say you're responsible for India?" Because I had briefed them on the AORs of the combatant commands. He says, "You're not responsible for India." That's insulting to me. I said, that's a really good point. You're responsible for it. Maybe we should call these areas of coordination. But I think your point is exactly correct, that because of the criticality of India, the largest democracy in the world, over 1 billion people, huge economy, and because of where they sit geographically in the world, that we want them to be a partner to the United States, not just militarily, but diplomatically, economically. And so I think it was a recognition of the critical importance of India, the name of the Pacific Command was changed to Indo-Pacific Command.
Thank you, sir.
And again, I think it's making a recognition that it's the Pacific feeling of the ocean, that there's the land, particularly the far western reaches of that particular geographical boundary.
Back over to this side of the room.
Hi, thank you so much, sir, for taking the time to talk to us today. My name is Claire Hewitt. I'm a law student and a student of global policy studies here at the LBJ School. And I really appreciate what you talked about today in terms of defense, especially in the digital age, is going to be data-driven. But the way that our peer competitors are approaching this topic is by using authoritarian tools, specifically looking at surveillance infrastructure as it spreads into Central Asia. And that level of information control isn't something that we, the United States, believe in. That's something that we've left to our private sector. So how do our defense entities compete with that level of control?
You're going to be a lawyer, right? So this is a wicked problem. So I'll give you an example. So if in a regular combat situation where I fire a kinetic projectile from an artillery piece, it flies through a geographical space, goes from point A through the air and lands at point B, and I can see in my mind's eye the geographical space of that. So what's the equivalent of a cyber shot? So I may hit the keyboard here in Austin, Texas. It may go to a server in Bangladesh, go to a server in Sudan, and then strike a target in another location. Did I violate the sovereignty of those nations? If your personal data was stored on that server in one of those places that I really don't care about, but because my cyber bomb went through there, did I violate your personal identifiable information? Did I violate your rights? I don't care about what pictures you have on your Facebook page. Be careful what pictures you have on your Facebook page. And so this is all is very, I don't know the answer to that. So in a liberal democracy like the United States, we respect your right to privacy. Others will use that to leverage to their advantage to gain access to networks because I don't want to violate your privacy. I don't. I'm not really interested in but I can't because if I go through that data storage area or that server farm or that cloud and I just because I'm through there, I don't really look at yours or touch it, but I do touch it. So how do I get around that? And so that's, are we going to change? Are we going to allow government entities? That was, we going to look for words. It's just like people that do these horrible active shooter things. A lot of times they leave signs prior to their event. They post keywords. Should we have an algorithm out there searching social media for somebody that's looking for the words shooting or school or rifle to try to preempt these things? With still being respectful of your rights. It's very difficult. In this new world we're in, there are all sorts of things like that, whether it be biogenetics, whether it be artificial intelligence, whether it be just a huge amount of data that's being stored. So, and then let alone try to figure it out in the United States to try to apply that globally around the world. Good luck.
Yeah, right here to your right.
Thank you. China clearly has an industrial policy, state capitalism, whatever you want to call it, that includes things like strategic industries, 5G technology, rare earths. In the defense strategy, do we have an economic component that you would characterize as an industrial policy key to national defense?
Yes. I would say that, again, in the unclassed version, it talks about at the end that last line of effort to improve processes and become more accountable and more efficient and go faster. So there's a whole series in there that talks about protection of industry, working with commercial entities, trying to improve the speed at which we acquire and iterate our equipment. There's even a thing in there about talent and people and how we're going to find the right people. There's a gentleman named Dr. Will Roper, who's kind of running that for the Secretary of Defense now. He used to work for the Air Force, and there's organizations and groups up there which are trying to reach out to commercial industry to try to improve these processes. And there's a recognition that there's certain industries in the United States that are critical, that need to be protected. And that some technologies, there's always a concern. Because since all the cutting edge technologies are commercial, how do you tell a commercial entity not to sell this particular capability to country X? So, it was easy before when it was just an analog mechanical thing. Now it's data, it's software, it's code. How do you protect that? And how do you keep people who can take those things, sell it for what appears to be a safe commercial application, but then someone can take that application and make it applicable to a military capability. But yes, to answer your question is yes, but again, it's a very difficult challenge, but that's why we need to be in partnership with the commercial side so that they understand what's going on. And that's part of the negotiation with China and the trade thing about copyright protection, protection of intellectual property, safety of our networks, etc.
All right, we'll do one or two more questions depending on length.
Thank you very much.
We have an administration that can be turned unfriendly to LGBTQ individuals and immigrants who want to come to the U.S. to become soldiers. How are you going to keep the military ranks full?
Well, I don't make policy. I mean, there are restrictions on anyone who's gay to serve in the U.S. military, as long as they can meet the standard. We're a standard-based organization, and there are any number of transgender people, transgender service members who are still serving today, as long as they are deployable and they can meet the standard. On the immigrant thing, the military still allows people to come in. I can only speak for the Marine Corps, and because a lot of people come to this country, they're brought here by their parents, or they immigrated illegally, and they join the military. The military is the ability for them to become naturalized citizens faster than if they had to wait for the 7 years that they wait in the normal population. So, again, if somebody can meet the standard and they have a desire to serve the United States, we are interested in talking to them. There are policies out there, in some cases, particularly with transgender, which restrict that, and we follow the rules. But we are a standards-based organization, so as far as I'm concerned, anyone who legally can enlist and they can meet the standard, we're interested in them becoming a Marine, a soldier, a sailor, an airman, or a Coast Guardsman.
All right, one last question over here.
Thank you, General, for your service. So I've been a journalist and I've covered Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, and for the most part, Iraq was there 2009, 10, was there 2013, and then ISIS, but they were coming all over. So I agree with the working with local partners. I was in the Mosul operation, the federal police, Iraqi special forces, was all from 2016 all the way through 2017. Been able to go back, see the reconstruction, and spent time in Syria, FSA, SDF. So I get the military option. Do you think rebuilding a society, jobs, water, things that people need, should that be upon the military? Do you see that as fixing the problem, fixing quote, to save lives in the end? Thank you.
I mean, we're basically asking, should the U.S. military be involved in nation building or rebuilding? And again, it depends on the context of where you are in the campaign. So we've all seen where, if you broke it, you obviously have a certain moral and ethical prerogative to try to fix it. I mean, you could leave, but I think that's the nature of Americans. We are very generous, helpful people by nature. But do I think that's our responsibility as the U.S. military? No, I do think it's kind of what General Colin Powell used to say, pottery house rules, you break it, you ruin it. That said, despite our best efforts to, create the conditions that would no longer give rise to insurgencies or despair on the part of the population, our effect has been mixed at best. That's a decision you make. It's kind of like, if you're going to go, I kind of, after my year-long scholarship in Iraq, one of my lessons learned was, if you're going to go and you're not going to stay, then you need to ask yourself, do you really want to go? So we went. So I think we have a certain, as long as the host nation wants us to stay, and they are at least working to try to fix the problem, I think, all things being equal, I would say we should stay and help them. But it's not the military's job to do that. I remember that around Marja in Afghanistan, all the irrigation and all the farmland and all the stuff, that was done by who? Like, it was, university engineers, I think from this state, went there and built that in the 50s or 60s or whenever they did it, to create, an agricultural economy. And it still exists, it's still there. Was that a good thing? I would say yes. So there's things that we can do, but at the end of the day, the country has got to fix themselves. We can advise them, we can assist them, we can help them, we can give them resources. But they have to provide good government, equitable government, laws enforceable with minimum corruption. And then they've got a possibility to make it happen. But I sense your frustration. I mean, it's difficult when you're in a land where you're a stranger in a strange land, to use the name of a book by Robert Hyman, to try to figure out and then try to tell people how to live their lives. So the answer to your question is no, that's not our responsibility, but I think we play a part.
Finally, let me just ask one final question as we wrap up here. There are a lot of students in the room here seeking careers in national security, whether from the military or in the broader national security community. We talked about some things that I wouldn't imagine we would have heard if we were all getting ready to land on Guadalcanal in 1942. I've heard about cyber, AI, CRISPR-Cas9, and biological technologies. What would you tell folks seeking a career in national security are some of the critical intellectual or skill set areas that we actually aren't ready for? If these students were getting ready to make their maximum benefit, are there any majors or languages or skill sets you'd say might be a good idea to pursue?
Well, if you want to work in the government, obviously you don't want to be rich. So don't do this if you think you're going to make a lot of money. I don't know if there's a single thing. I think everybody's got to find their own place. Obviously, the talents and the skills that the government and even the military is looking for is different. Some people want to be involved in small unit level stuff and leading young men and women who are really motivated, for the most part, really motivated and energetic and enthusiastic and want to be challenged. But if you write code, or you're good on the computer, or you're a writer, or you're good at information operations, then we got a place for you too. So there really is no one thing. I think the bottom line is that you want to serve your nation. You're willing to put your personal desires and your personal needs aside for the greater good of the team. And you'd be given an opportunity to be given responsibility much higher or greater than I think your peers that just go to the commercial side at the beginning. And we're going to give you people and stuff and tell you to go out there and get it done, and we're expecting you to get it done. And we really don't want to listen to any reason why it didn't happen. Because, this is serious business. Serious business. And yeah, we train, but at the end of the day, imagine like for those sailors and Marines and soldiers that landed on Guadalcanal, I mean, the reality of, hey, I'm going on an occupied enemy island, and those people want to do harm to me, and I'm got to be willing to do harm to them. So that reality is every day for the U.S. military. You have to be prepared that that's the day you get the call. So it's a commitment, and so I would encourage anybody who want that. You're going to work with really good people. You're going to be challenged, and I think you're going to get an experience that's going to help you realize what you want to do for the rest of your life. So, but if that's not where you want to go, that's fine too. But I appreciate everybody's attention and sticking around, and thank you for your time.